So I'd like to start out by saying that as much as I'm referring to this as some form of sleep paralysis, I'm not certain that this is the correct term, nor do I exactly know what happened to me. However, for the sake of better understanding for those of you interested in exactly how this experience felt, I feel that sleep paralysis is the best choice of words. I would also like to note that I did not and to this day do not use any form of drug or take any kind of medication, thus proving that the story could not in no form be related to some form of side effect. The first experience I had was almost 3 years ago now. I was soundly asleep in my Connecticut home. It was likely between midnight and 3 a.m., but I can't really be sure as I had no clock in my vicinity. I woke up abruptly from my deep sleep state, but I hadn't yet opened my eyes. I was listening to the rain and light wind outside. I then recalled the weather forecast, and no chance of rain was scheduled overnight. Actually, no rain was scheduled for the whole week. It was at this point that I opened my eyes, and I can't stress enough what a mistake that was. Above my head was this black mass. It resembled that of which people think of when you say black hole in outer space. I'm not someone who scares easy, so I attempted to get up and attack the object. I couldn't move. I could feel everything, my head against the pillow, my arms and legs, everything. But I could not move. It seemed that the only motor skills I still had were control over my eyes and mouth. My breathing even seemed to be in some sort of autopilot. Realizing that there was absolutely nothing I could do, I just tried to call out for help, but nothing would come out but air. So I was stuck, just facing this strange entity, unsure of how numbered my moments in life really were. Something that strikes me as odd now that I had overlooked all these years is the fact that I was sleeping on my back, face up. I have never been comfortable in that position for any considerable amount of time, so why I was laying that way I'm unsure. I decided to do something that I normally would not do. I let fate take control, and I simply closed my eyes. I woke about 8:30 a.m., totally fine. It also had not rained that night. The ground was bone dry. After some time, the thought of the entity slipped to the back of my head, and my job and college education, more likely than not, had everything to do with my lack of pursuit for some truth or reasonable explanation for the summer's events. It's now the middle of winter. I'm driving through a blizzard on my way to my fiance's family home in Rhode Island. It's about a 2.5 hour drive on a good day, but the 4 feet of snow on the unplowed roads meant I was blazing a trail at more likely than not a steady 35 to 40 miles an hour. After getting tired of listening to the CD of 1970s rock I'd burned, anticipating the long drive, I turned off the radio and took a drink of coffee. I was tired, and it was roughly midnight. I recalled my childhood years sitting in this very Jeep. My father and I used to pull 15-plus hour drives all over the East Coast, and at all times of the night. He would switch the radio to AM because Art Bell would be on. If you're not familiar with Art Bell, he is a radio broadcaster whom discusses a wide assortment of topics regarding paranormal entities, life in outer space, and even politics. He was a huge success, and as much as I am a skeptic of most things, his words certainly made even me think as well as it would be a good way to pass the time. Remembering this and seeing the dash reading something in the 12 o'clock hour, I turned the radio on and switched it to AM. He was mid-show discussing some topic with a guest on the show. For a good 10 minutes or so, I was still deciphering exactly what they were discussing. When I had caught on, my focus was fully on the show. And despite the warm Jeep, chills rolled down my spine. The woman who was a guest on the show was talking about the exact events I had myself experienced. She was talking about the black entity. If the reminder of the summer's past events wasn't enough, she also said she sees it almost every night. At this point, I'm eager to hear how she manages it. But the show breaks off to callers. A large quantity of callers then call in saying they had seen the entity as well. To sum it up, apparently people all over the world have dealt with this thing. Upon arriving in Rhode Island, I explained the whole thing to who was at the time my fiancée. I had never bothered to tell her about the other entity experience because I didn't quite understand it myself. and no person would think you had a sane mind when discussing something of that nature. My fiancé was genuinely worried. Roughly a year goes by, and once again the entity is pushed out of my head. One night I lie in bed, this time with my partner, and I wake up to the sound of rain. Thinking nothing of it, I decide to go get a drink before going back to sleep. I'd like to pause the story here to make a note of something rather important. When I had finally sent this story out, quite a few concerned friends did their own research about the happenings. They all turned up information on lucid dreaming and that it's a common trick of the mind. It's the events that I'm about to discuss with you and something I came across recently that led me to believe that this is something other than some extreme lucid dream. To get back to the story, I was intending on getting up to get a drink. As I opened my eyes, I saw what looked like the entity in the upper corner of the wall on the opposite side of the room. It was different this time. It was still the black hole, smoggy body, but this time it seemed to have some form of white, skull-like face. Almost like a floating face of a skeleton in the midst of a black smog. I was able to move, but I was worried pursuing this entity would endanger my fiancé, whom was asleep next to me. I decided to just close my eyes and hope it leaves, or at least leaves my fiancé alone. After something I read recently, going back to sleep may have been the best choice I ever made. And just like my prior experience, I did hear the sound of rain, and in the morning the ground was bone dry. I have had no other event with the black entity, or waking up unable to move. But I came across something recently that had once again reminded me of the strange events from the past. It was something a man posted regarding the entity. He discussed the issue with it as well as sleep paralysis, and it goes back as far as his childhood. He says he used to see the entity often, but hadn't in quite some time. This is until he moved back into his parents' house while his new place of living was being built. He was taking photos and videos on Snapchat. Someone messaged him asking about who that was behind him, or at least he asked something to that degree. I can't remember the exact details. To sum it up, he saved the snaps to his phone, then to his computer, and this is when things get interesting. With the help of some fellow internet users, the photos were enhanced and you could clearly see something peeking in from 2 different windows, and then standing inside his house. After a few nights of not all that much, he actually experiences the entity making a lot of noise outside, pushing things and tapping on the glass, moving at unreal speeds. He also had this on video. Recently, I have been hearing strange noises off and on, even during daytime when I am studying for college. I also have felt watched and followed, 2 things I have never felt and been wrong about. The most prominent sign that something was up was from a few nights ago. I was leaving work. It was roughly a little past 8 p.m. I was driving home. I live in the woods, so the ride home is just a double yellow road winding through the thick trees. My engine stalled out, so I pulled over only to have no luck starting it. I opened the hood to find everything mechanically sound as well as the fuel pump working. The gauge said half a tank, but I asked someone to bring me fuel anyways because it sounded like it wasn't getting gas while I was cranking the engine. I leaned against the grill of the Jeep with only the flashing hazards giving off light. The only noise aside from the mechanical clicks and whirs from all the little parts that make the hazards flash, the only sounds was the sound of the wind in the trees. At some point I hear what can clearly be recognized as human footsteps in the forest underbrush. It was however out of my view distance due to the total darkness of the forest. As I had gone back to my Jeep for the phone to use as a light in order to pursue this noise, my gasoline arrived. I put it in the tank and sure enough it started. Apparently the wire that tells the gauge how much fuel I have was faulty. No surprise on a 300,000 mile car from 1999. Things get old. I don't know that the sound of footsteps in the woods was for sure human. I can't even be sure that the recent watched and followed feeling has anything to do with the entity. But what I do know is there must be some form of truth or explanation out there. some means of better explaining this strange phenomenon, better than labeling it as some lucid dream state and the trickery of the human mind. Or acknowledging the possibility that it is just trickery of the mind, then perhaps some way to prevent it. And for that reason, I post my story. Not for attention, just rather the truth. I hope my story, as well as stories of many others, will help find that. I'd like to thank the large group of friends whom assisted me in the large amounts of research regarding this topic. Even my ex deserves some form of credit, as she did what she could to help out at the time that these events actually took place.